You know the name Warren Buffett. Almost everyone does. What almost nobody can tell you is the name of the man who taught him, or that this man once boarded a train with a single sheet of paper, walked into a room of oil executives, and lost. January 1927, Oil City, Pennsylvania. A fund manager named Benjamin Graham arrives at a shareholders meeting holding a resolution because he has found something in a public document that this company would prefer nobody read. He stands. He asks to put his motion, and the chairman asks one procedural question that ends it on the spot. Does anyone second the motion? Graham has traveled hundreds of miles alone. Silence. The meeting moves on. In the next half hour, you get what he did about that. Not revenge, method. A humiliated man went away, worked out where the power in a company actually sits, came back, and took it. Stay to the end, and you have the tool he built out of it, a way to separate what a thing is worth from what it costs. He invented the words we still use for that. So, start with who was on that train, because it explains the way he thought. He was born Benjamin Grossbaum in London on the 9th of May, 1894. The family emigrated to New York while he was still an infant. For a while, they were comfortable. His father ran an importing business, and then his father died young, and the business went with him. His mother tried to hold the household together against a market she did not understand. She was wiped out in the financial panic that hit the American market when Benjamin was a boy. Not through recklessness in the way people imagine, through owning things whose real nature nobody in the house could examine. That detail is not color, it is the origin of everything that follows. He grew up inside a family that had money and then did not, and the reason was never something anyone could point at and inspect. He was academically extraordinary. He went to Columbia University on a scholarship and graduated in 1914 as salutatorian, second in his entire class. 3 separate departments offered him a teaching post: philosophy, mathematics, and English. He turned down all 3 and went to Wall Street. And the reason matters. He needed the money. The family finances were still broken. So the most gifted student of his year took a job as a runner, physically carrying quotes and securities between offices. Now understand what Wall Street was in 1914. Because if you picture anything like a modern market, you will misread this entire episode. It ran on relationships, rumor, and personal judgment. Companies were not required to publish the kind of accounts you can pull up on a phone in 4 seconds today. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission. It would not exist for another 20 years. There was no standardized annual report. There was in many cases no reliable public statement of what a company owned, not because anyone was breaking a law, but because no law existed requiring it. The owner of a business could be told less about that business than his own bank manager knew. So how did anyone decide what a share was worth? Mostly by asking what other people thought it was worth. Tips. Reputation. Whether the man running the company looked prosperous, whether the price had lately been going up. Graham found that unbearable. Not immoral. Unbearable, almost physically. He had a mathematician's mind dropped into a business that ran on mood, and he began doing something so obvious it barely sounds like an insight. He read the documents. Not the newspapers, not the tip sheets, the actual filings companies were required to send to regulators, line by line. Looking not for a story, but for numbers that did not agree with the price. And he was fast at it. Within a few years, he had gone from runner to writing research, and from research to running money. He built a reputation for a specific and slightly strange skill, finding situations where the arithmetic was simply wrong. Some of that early work was arbitrage, buying one security and selling a related one when the mathematical relationship between them had come apart. Unglamorous, low drama, and consistently profitable, which describes his entire career. And there is something worth noticing in that choice, because it is the same choice he made every time afterwards. He was not looking for the biggest possible gain. He was looking for the situation where he could be most certain of the number. Those are different searches, and they lead to different lives. He also, from very early on, wrote everything down. Not predictions, procedures, what he had looked at, what he had checked, what would have to be true for him to be wrong. 20 years later, that habit became two of the most influential books ever written about money. By 1926, he was running his own investment partnership alongside a man named Jerome Newman. Newman handled the business and the operations, Graham handled the analysis. That arrangement lasted 30 years. And here is the frame for everything that follows. There are two ways to try to make money in a market. You can guess what the crowd will do next, or you can find out what something is actually worth and pay less than that. The first way had been the whole of Wall Street for a century. Graham was about to demonstrate in public and in front of witnesses that the second way was not a theory. 1926, Washington, D.C. The reading room of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the federal body that regulated railroads and, because pipelines are a kind of railroad for liquid, the pipeline companies too. This is not a glamorous room. It is where regulated companies file the detailed financial reports the law obliges them to file. Almost nobody goes there. That is the entire point of this story. Because here is the asymmetry Graham had spotted. A regulated company must tell the regulator the truth in detail. It is under no similar obligation to make that same detail easy for its own shareholders to find. The information was public. Public is not the same as visible. Public means the door is unlocked. Visible means somebody walked through it. Graham walked through it. He sat down with the filings of pipeline companies, dull, unfashionable, slow-growing businesses that moved oil through tubes and were priced by the market accordingly. Understand why the market did not care about them. A pipeline does not grow. It does not launch products. It charges a regulated fee to move a commodity, year after year, and that is the whole business. In the 1920s, that made it the least fashionable thing on the exchange. He pulled the file for a company called Northern Pipeline, and in the detail of that federal filing, he found something that did not appear in what the company sent to its own shareholders. Northern Pipeline owned a large portfolio of high-grade railroad bonds, not pipe, not equipment, bonds, sitting quietly, earning interest, fully listed in the federal filing, and effectively invisible to anyone reading the ordinary shareholder communications. Why would a pipeline company be sitting on a pile of railroad bonds? Because it had been profitable for a long time, had no particular use for the cash, and the people running it had simply parked the surplus rather than send it back to the owners. Now do the arithmetic. Graham did, because it is the simplest and most powerful moment in this episode. Take the value of those bonds, divide by the number of shares outstanding. The answer came to roughly $95 a share. Then look at what the stock was actually changing hands for on the market, around $65. Sit with that for a second. The company's holdings of safe, liquid, easily sold bonds were worth about $95 for every single share, and you could buy a share for $65. Which means the pipeline itself, the operating business, the physical asset, the actual profits it earned every year, was being handed to you for less than nothing. You were being paid $30 a share to accept it. And I want to be careful here, because this is where people hear a fairy tale. It was not free money. The bonds were only worth $95 a share to you if somebody with the power to do so actually sold them and handed over the proceeds, which nobody had any intention of doing. That is the trap in the whole situation, and Graham had to solve it before the arithmetic meant anything at all. This is also not a clever trade. It is an arithmetic error sitting in public view. It had been sitting there because the information lived in one building in Washington and a price was being set in another building in New York, and nobody had bothered to carry the number from one to the other. Graham started buying. Not a token position. He bought steadily until his partnership owned about 5% of the company, enough that he could not be waved away as a crank with one share and an opinion. Then he went to see the management and made what he considered an entirely reasonable suggestion. The bonds are not needed to operate a pipeline. Sell them and give the proceeds to the people who own this company. Which is us. The answer he got back is the sentence that runs through the entire history of shareholder activism. In substance, running a pipeline is a complex business. You are not qualified to judge it, and if you are unhappy with our management, you are free to sell your shares. Read that again, because it is doing something very specific. It is not an argument, it is a dismissal. The assertion that the owner of a business has no standing to ask the manager of that business what he is doing with the owner's money. And in 1926, that assertion was more or less how the entire market worked. Directors were a club, shareholders were a mailing list. Which is why what happened next mattered far beyond one pipeline company in Pennsylvania. So, Graham did the thing you are supposed to do. If management will not listen, take it to the annual meeting, where the owners vote. That is what the meeting is for. The annual meeting of Northern Pipeline was held in January 1927 in Oil City, Pennsylvania, not New York. Oil City, a small town in the northwest corner of the state, hours from anywhere in the depths of winter. Notice that, because it is not an accident of geography. A meeting held far from where your shareholders live is a meeting most of your shareholders will not attend. Distance is a defense, and it is a defense that is still used today. Graham made the journey anyway. He arrived with his resolution written out: sell the surplus bonds, distribute the proceeds to the shareholders who already own them. Picture the room. A handful of people, most of them company men, in a small town in January, going through the ritual of a corporate meeting that has never in its history contained a surprise. And understand what a resolution at a shareholders meeting actually is? Because it is not a complaint, it is an instruction. If the owners of a company vote for it, the people running that company are obliged to carry it out. That is the whole architecture of a corporation. The meeting opens. Graham asks the chair to read his resolution. Oh! And the chairman does something procedurally flawless. He asks whether anyone present will second the motion. Silence. Under the rules of order governing that meeting, a motion nobody seconds is not debated, not voted on, and not even read aloud. It does not exist. The chairman moves to the next item of business. Graham had done the analysis of his career. He had been right about every number in it. He had crossed a state in January to say it out loud in the one room where saying it counted. And he was beaten by a rule of order he had simply never thought about. Now I want to stop because this is the part that gets skipped in every retelling, and it is the most useful part of the whole episode. Being right is not a mechanism. Being right does not by itself do anything at all. A correct analysis with no route to a decision is a private opinion, however good the arithmetic behind it. The distance between having the right answer and being able to act on it is the distance most people never cross. In markets, in companies, in almost anything that involves more than one person. And it is worth naming what he was actually up against, because it was not one chairman being rude, it was a structure. The people running that company controlled the meeting, the agenda, the location, and the flow of information to the owners. None of that was illegal. Most of it was not even unusual. It was simply how power inside a corporation was arranged, and the arrangement quietly assumed the owners would never organize. And there is a quieter humiliation inside the loud one. He had to travel back, hours across Pennsylvania in winter, with the resolution still in his pocket, unread, having said essentially nothing in a room he had crossed a state to reach. Most people at that point sell the stock. They take the small loss, tell the story at dinner as a joke about corporate arrogance, and never go near it again. That reaction is so normal it is almost invisible. Graham went home from Oil City having discovered that the gap between right and effective existed, and that it was procedural rather than intellectual, which is good news because procedure can be learned. So, he spent the following year closing it, and he closed it in the most unglamorous way imaginable. Here is what he understood after Oil City. Ownership of a company is not an opinion. It is a count of votes. He had been arguing when he should have been counting. So through 1927, he bought more Northern Pipeline stock. And, far more importantly, he went and found the other owners. Small holders, estates, trusts, institutions, people who owned a few hundred shares and had never once been asked what they thought about anything, because in the entire history of the company, nobody had ever bothered to write to them. And he asked each of them for a proxy. Oh! A proxy is nothing more than a signed piece of paper that lets someone else cast your vote at a meeting you are not going to attend. It is the most boring instrument in corporate law. It is also where the power is kept. This is the sentence I would like you to take out of this episode. Graham did not win an argument. He collected signatures. And think about what the work actually looked like. There is no shareholder email list. He has to obtain the register, write letters, explain a bond portfolio to people who have never read a balance sheet, and persuade them that signing a piece of paper for a stranger is safe. It is tedious, slow, unglamorous work with no guarantee of a result, which is exactly why nobody had done it before and exactly why it worked. Among the shareholders was the Rockefeller Foundation, which held stock in the company as an investment. The foundation was not an activist. It was a large, cautious institution that would ordinarily prefer not to be anywhere near a public fight. It came down on the side of distributing the spare cash, with the message that the company should hand back as much as the business could genuinely spare. And that changed the character of the entire dispute. Once a large, respectable institution says out loud that the owners have a point, the awkward shareholder with a resolution stops being a crank and starts being the majority view. The 1928 annual meeting. Graham comes back to the same room, and this time he arrives holding proxies for around 38% of the company's shares. 38% is not control. But at a meeting where management holds nothing like a majority of the stock themselves, and where most shareholders never appear, 38% voted as a single block is decisive. He elected 2 directors to the board. One of them was Benjamin Graham. The man who could not get a motion seconded 12 months earlier was now sitting on the board deciding what the company did with its money. And the company did what he had asked for the year before. It distributed $50 a share to its shareholders, $50 a share, on a stock he had been buying at around $65, handed back in cash to the owners out of assets the owners already owned and had simply never been shown. And they still owned the pipeline afterwards. Look at what actually happened. Stripped of the drama, no product was invented, no market was predicted, nothing was traded cleverly. A man read a public document, worked out what a company was really worth, and then used the ordinary machinery of ownership to make that value visible to everybody else. That is the whole discipline in one campaign. It is also, historically, one of the first modern shareholder campaigns, the template every activist investor since has been working from, mostly without knowing whose template it is. And Graham did not treat it as a one-off. He went looking for the same shape elsewhere. Profitable, unfashionable companies sitting on assets worth more than the market price of the whole business, run by people who had stopped thinking of shareholders as owners. Because the pattern he had found was not really about pipelines. It was about a gap between what a company is and what a company is priced at, held open by the fact that almost nobody checks. If the story ended here, it would be satisfying and slightly dangerous, because it would suggest that if your analysis is good enough, you win. The next 2 years took that idea and broke it over their knee. 1929. Graham was, by any measure, at the top of his profession. His partnership was running around $2.5 million at the start of that year, which in the money of the time is a serious fund. He was not a reckless man. He was the careful one, the analyst, the one who read the filings, the one who bought things for less than the asset standing behind them. And he was not simply long the market and hoping. He held hedges, positions designed to make money if prices fell, precisely so that a general decline could not destroy him. It did not matter. Between 1929 and 1932, his fund lost about 70%. The Dow lost about 80%, so he did better than the market, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like consolation and is not, because 70% of your client's money is still 70% of your client's money. I want to be exact about this because this is where most retellings quietly cheat. Benjamin Graham did not see the crash coming. He did not sidestep it. The founder of the entire idea of investing conservatively was cut down by it like everybody else. And it was worse than a single bad year because the market did not fall once. It fell, recovered enough to look like a bottom, and then fell again, twice. Think about what that does to a careful man. The first fall makes bargains. You buy them because they are genuinely cheap by every measure you have. Then the second fall takes those too, and the thing punishing you is your own discipline. He did not walk away. He kept the partnership alive through the worst years of the Depression, took little or nothing out of it for a long stretch, and worked the losses back over the following years. And that decision is the one I would ask you to weigh, because it was not the obvious one. He had a reputation, 3 university departments that had once wanted him, and an easy exit into teaching. He stayed with the wreck he had made and repaired it in front of the people it had happened to. By the middle of the 1930s, the fund was whole again, and the man running it had a very different relationship with his own confidence than the man who had walked into 1929. Oh! But something in the method changed permanently, and that change is the real inheritance. Before the crash, Graham's insight was, find out what a thing is worth and pay less than that. After the crash, he added the sentence that made it survivable. Pay so much less that you can be wrong. That is the margin of safety. It is not a mood, and it is not caution as a personality trait. It is a number, the distance you deliberately leave between what you pay and what you believe the thing is worth, sized so that if your analysis is flawed, you still are not destroyed. Because his analysis in 1929 had been good. Good was not enough. What he had lacked was room to be wrong, and the whole of his mature philosophy is an attempt to build that room in on purpose before it is needed. And notice, this is not a lesson about markets specifically. Every plan anyone makes about the future is an estimate. The thing that separates people who survive their own mistakes from people who do not is whether they left room to be wrong. There is a second lesson in those 3 years, and it is harder. He had been right about Northern Pipeline and been proved right within 2 years. He was also right about a great many things in 1929, and it took the better part of a decade. Being right early and being wrong are indistinguishable while you are living through them. That is not a flaw in the method. That is the cost of the method, and Graham is the man who paid it in public. In 1934, with the wreckage still fresh, Graham published, with his Columbia colleague David Dodd, a book called Security Analysis. It is heavy, technical, and deeply unglamorous, and it did something no book had done before. It set out a systematic method for working out what a business is worth from its own published accounts, rather than from what people were saying about it. That timing is not incidental. He wrote the definitive book on careful investing immediately after the period that had just destroyed most of his clients' capital. It is a book written by someone with no illusions left. The same years brought the thing that made the method usable for everybody else, the new securities laws, and with them the requirement that public companies actually publish audited accounts on a schedule. Graham had spent a decade digging information out of federal filing rooms. From the mid-30s onward, the information came to you. His method arrived at exactly the moment the raw material became generally available. 15 years later, in 1949, he published the one that reached the public, The Intelligent Investor. Same discipline, written for a person who has a job, some savings, and no research department. Inside it are the 2 ideas that outlived him. The first you already have: the margin of safety. The second is a character he invented, and it is, I think, the single most useful thing ever written about the psychology of owning anything at all. Graham asks you to imagine you have a business partner named Mr. Market. Mr. Market turns up every day without fail and offers you a price. Some days he is euphoric and offers you a fortune for your share of the business. Some days he is in despair and offers you almost nothing for the same share of the same business. And here's the point. Mr. Market is not there to tell you what your share is worth. He is there to give you a price which you may accept or ignore entirely as you choose. He is not a thermometer. He has no idea what the business is worth. He has a mood. What that image does is separate 2 things almost everyone welds together: the value of a thing and the price being quoted for it today. The quote is information about the person quoting. It is not information about the thing. And Graham gave his followers something even more concrete: rules with numbers in them. Buy at a discount to what the assets alone would fetch. Insist on a company that has actually earned money for years. Diversify, because you will be wrong about individual cases. He is sometimes caricatured as a man who bought junk because it was cheap. That is not it. He bought ordinary businesses at prices that assumed disaster, and he sized his positions so that when disaster occasionally arrived, it was survivable. now the other half of his legacy, and he would not have chosen it. In 1948, his partnership bought half of a small car insurance company called GEICO for $712,000. And it immediately created a problem, because an investment company of that type was not permitted to hold a controlling stake in an insurer, so the position could not simply be kept. The shares had to be handed out to the partnership's own shareholders. That single position went on to be worth more than everything the fund made on all its other positions put together. Which is genuinely funny, and Graham knew it. The man who wrote the book on buying cheap statistical bargains made his largest fortune on one exceptional business that he was legally required to give away to his own investors. It is also the crack in his own doctrine, and the crack is where the next episode comes from. Graham's method is built to protect you from being wrong. It is not built to hold on to something that turns out to be extraordinary. He taught at Columbia for years, and one of his students in that classroom, later an employee at his firm, was a young man from Omaha named Warren Buffett, who has spent a public lifetime saying exactly where the method came from. Graham retired from the partnership with Jerome Newman in 1956. He died on the 21st of September 1976 in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. He was 82 years old. And the thing to hold on to is that he did not leave behind a portfolio or a prediction or a system for getting rich. He left behind a way of asking questions that any person with no special access can use. So what do you actually take out of this tonight with no terminal, no fund, and no research department? First, the advantage is usually not secret. It is public and boring. Graham's great discovery sat in a federal filing anyone was entitled to read in a building anyone could walk into. His edge was reading the primary document instead of the summary written about it. That edge still exists, and almost nobody takes it. Second, separate price from value deliberately and in writing. Work out what a thing is worth on its own terms first, and only then look at what is being asked for it. Mr. Market's number is a fact about his mood today. It is not a fact about the thing. Third, build in the room to be wrong. Graham's analysis in 1929 was excellent, and he still lost 70%. If a decision only works when you turn out to be right, it is not a good decision, however good the reasoning behind it. And fourth, the one from Oil City, which is not about money at all. Being right is not a mechanism. If you cannot see the route from your correct answer to an actual decision, you do not have a plan. You have an opinion. He needed one person to second him, and he had not brought one. The next year, he brought 38%. And notice that not one of those four requires money to practice. They are habits of attention. The reason Graham is the first name in the series rather than the richest one is that everything he built is available to somebody with a library card and some patience. There is one last thing, and it is why this episode leads the series instead of closing it. Graham handed the method to a student, and that student did something Graham himself never quite did. He kept the arithmetic of cheapness and added a question about the quality of the business underneath it. Next episode, the paper route, the pinball machines, the partnership, and the letters. Warren Buffett told strictly from the public record, the pupil who kept the margin of safety and threw away half the rest. If this was useful, follow the channel. New episode every Tuesday.